On the afternoon of April 4, 1922, three men, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel, stepped onto the Hinterkaifeck farmstead. The air was unnervingly still. For several days, the homestead had become a black hole in the local community. 7-year-old Kazilia had skipped school. The mail was untouched. The neighbors had noticed a lack of movement, yet strangely the livestock seemed quiet, not the frantic braying of starving animals. Schlittenbauer led the way to the barn. He pried open the door, expecting to find the Grubers busy with chores. Instead he found a tomb. In the corner of the stable, near the door leading to the living quarters, lay a pile of straw and a heavy, discarded wooden door. Schlittenbauer reached down and pulled the door back. Beneath it lay the patriarch Andreas Gruber, his wife Kazilia, their daughter Victoria and young Kazilia. They were stacked one on top of the other. Their faces were unrecognizable, their skulls shattered by a heavy, blunt object. The search party didn't stop there. They rushed into the farmhouse, calling out names into the silence. In the maid's room they found Maria Baumgartner. She had arrived at the farm just 5 hours before her death. Her suitcase remained packed at the foot of her bed. Finally they entered the nursery. Inside a small crib, 2-year-old Joseph had been struck through the protective canopy of his bed. 6 people were dead. The perpetrator had vanished. Examinations conducted by state physician Dr. Johann Baptist Aumüller revealed a clinical, terrifying timeline. The murders did not happen on the day the bodies were found. They occurred on the night of Friday, March 31st. This meant that for 4 full days, the Hinterkaifeck farm had been a graveyard inhabited by a living ghost. Forensic evidence inside the house proved that the killer never left. While the 6 victims lay cooling in the barn and the nursery, the killer made themselves at home. Investigators found that the 43 head of cattle had been meticulously fed and milked throughout the weekend. The kitchen told an even darker story. Someone had used the stove to cook meals, consumed the family's bread, and drank their cider. Neighbors later testified to seeing smoke curling from the chimney on Sunday and Monday, days after the family had breathed their last. Even more chilling, the beds in the master bedroom had been slept in as recently as Monday night. The killer had tucked themselves into the sheets of the people they had just slaughtered. This was not a robbery. This was a psychological takeover. The killer didn't just want the Grubers dead, they wanted their life. In most homicides, the hot period, the time the killer spends at the scene, is measured in minutes. At Hinterkaifeck it was measured in days. The murderer walked among the dead, performed the daily chores of the victims, and sat by the fire in a house filled with the scent of iron and rot. The impact of this discovery paralyzed the small town of Kaifeck. It suggested a level of sociopathy that went beyond simple violence. The killer was comfortable in the carnage. They were so unafraid of being caught that they continued the farm's routine, essentially becoming the new father of the household for a long weekend. When the neighbors finally broke down the door, they weren't just discovering a crime scene. They were interrupting a man who had decided that the Hinterkaifeck farm belonged to him, and he had simply cleared the previous tenants out of the way. The killer had left just hours before the search party arrived, leaving the house warm and the livestock fed for the men who found the bodies. The massacre on March 31st was not a sudden explosion of violence. It was the inevitable conclusion of a month-long psychological siege. 4 weeks leading up to the final blow, the Gruber family was being stalked from within their own walls. It began in the late autumn of 1921 when the farm's previous maid, Crescens Rieger, fled the property in a state of sheer terror. She didn't quit because of the grueling labor or the isolation. She quit because she was convinced the house was haunted. She told the villagers of Weidhofen that she heard rhythmic thumping in the attic and disembodied whispers in the hallways. Andreas Gruber, known for his abrasive and cold demeanor, dismissed her as hysterical. He laughed at the idea of ghosts, unaware that the ghost was a flesh-and-blood predator carving out a living space above his head. By March 1922, the phenomena became impossible to ignore. Andreas found a trail of footprints in the fresh morning snow. They began at the thick edge of the forest and led directly toward the farmhouse. He followed the tracks, expecting to find where the intruder had circled back to the woods. He never did. The footprints stopped at the back door. There were no return tracks. Someone had entered the home, and as far as the snow was concerned, they were still there. Inside, the paranoia escalated. Andreas found a Munich newspaper on the porch, a paper he didn't buy in a town where no one subscribed to it. Then the house keys vanished. A heavy brass set of keys, essential for locking the main house and the tool shed, disappeared from the kitchen table. Andreas searched every inch of the property, but the keys were gone, likely repurposed by the shadow moving through the crawl spaces. On the morning of March 30th, one day before the murders, Andreas visited his neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He wasn't there for a social call, he was a man at his breaking point. He reported hearing footsteps in the ceiling, not the light scurrying of rats but the heavy, deliberate tread of a grown man. He described finding scratch marks on the lock of the family's motorized grain mill, as if someone had tried to tamper with the machinery. Despite his fear, Andreas's pride was his undoing. When Schlittenbauer offered to lend him a firearm for protection, Andreas refused. He believed he could handle whatever was hiding in his shadows with his own hands and a farm tool. Physical evidence recovered later in the attic confirmed that Andreas wasn't imagining things. Investigators found a section of the attic floor where the insulation had been moved to create a nest. From this vantage point, a person lying flat on their stomach could look through narrow gaps in the floorboards directly into the kitchen and the living room. The killer had a front row seat to the family's most private moments. They watched the Grubers eat dinner, they watched them argue, they watched them sleep. The killer had even moved several roof tiles to create a makeshift telescope view of the road leading to the farm, ensuring they would see any police or visitors long before they arrived. The prelude to Hinterkaifeck transforms the case from a murder mystery into a nightmare of domestic violation. It proves that the victims lived their final days in a state of predatory containment. They were not just killed, they were harvested. The impact of the footprints in the snow detail remains one of the most chilling tropes in true crime history because it represents the ultimate loss of security. The home, which should be a fortress, had become a cage. For the killer, the weeks leading up to the crime were a period of psychological grooming. By stealing the keys and leaving the newspaper, the intruder was playing a game of dominance. They wanted the Grubers to know they were there, but they wanted to remain just out of sight, forcing the family to live in a state of high cortisol dread. This prolonged stalking suggests that the motive was deeply personal. This wasn't a burglar looking for a quick score. This was a hunter who derived satisfaction from the terror of his prey. The Grubers spent their last week on Earth listening to their killer breathe through the ceiling, never realizing that the ghost in the attic was simply waiting for the moon to fade so he could begin his work. The air in the Hinterkaifeck barn was thick with the scent of pine and iron when the Munich police finally arrived on April 6. Lead Inspector George Reingruber didn't find a clean crime scene. He found a chaotic, contaminated mess. In the 48 hours between the discovery of the bodies and the arrival of professional detectives, dozens of villagers had swarmed the property. They had moved the corpses to look at their faces, sat at the kitchen table to eat the family's remaining bread, and even fed the cattle. This initial failure of cordoning off the farm meant that any fingerprints or subtle tracks left by the killer were erased under the boots of curious neighbors. Reingruber was left to piece together a puzzle using broken shards. The brutality of the wounds suggested a perpetrator of immense physical strength and cold-blooded precision. Each victim had been struck in the head with a pickaxe-like tool, specifically a mattock. Most died from a single, shattering blow, but 7-year-old Kazilia's death was more lingering. Medical examiners discovered that she had survived the initial attack for several hours, lying in the hay next to her dead mother. In her final state of shock, she had torn out clumps of her own hair. This detail shifted the investigation's focus. The police weren't looking for a panicked amateur. They were looking for someone comfortable with extreme violence and the prolonged presence of the dying. Suspicion immediately fell on Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who led the search party. The village knew of his complicated history with the Grubers. He had been in a volatile relationship with Victoria and was the presumed father of 2-year-old Joseph, though he had recently tried to sue the family for child support. When the bodies were found, Schlittenbauer's behavior was erratic. While others recoiled in horror, he reportedly walked right up to the corpses and disturbed them. He claimed he was looking for his son, but to the police, it looked like he was checking his work. Furthermore, he was the only person who could effortlessly unlock the farm's doors that had been barred from the inside, suggesting he might have still possessed those missing house keys. The investigation then took a turn into the supernatural when a theory emerged that the killer was a dead man. Carl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, had been reported killed in the trenches of France in 1914. However, his body was never recovered, and his comrades gave conflicting reports about his death. A persistent rumor began to spread that Gabriel hadn't died, but had been captured, escaped, and returned home to find his wife had moved on and birthed a child with a neighbor. The theory suggested that Gabriel, fueled by a decade of war-hardened rage and a sense of betrayal, lived in the attic of his own home, watching his family until he decided to annihilate them. Soldiers from his unit were interrogated, and while some swore they saw him fall, others claimed he had simply vanished in the smoke of battle. Despite the mounting theories, the evidence remained frustratingly thin. The police interviewed over 100 suspects, ranging from local vagrants to traveling craftsmen. They even resorted to the bizarre. The victims' heads were severed and sent to clairvoyants in Munich, hoping that psychic impressions might reveal the killer's face. The skulls were never returned, eventually lost during the Allied bombings of World War II. The motive for the crime remained the biggest hurdle. Over 100,000 gold marks were found in the house, sitting in plain sight. If the motive was robbery, the killer was the most incompetent thief in history. If the motive was revenge, why stay for 4 days to feed the cows? The case went cold as the years bled into decades, but the impact on the region was permanent. The local community became insular and suspicious, with neighbors eyeing each other over fences for the next 50 years. The investigation revealed a family that lived in a state of moral and physical isolation, making them the perfect prey. By the time the farm was finally demolished in 1923, the police had no more answers than they did on the day of the discovery. They found the murder weapon hidden under the floorboards of the attic, exactly where the intruder had been sleeping. It was the final taunt from a killer who had successfully outplayed the state's best detectives. By 1923, the Hinterkaifeck farmstead had become a sight of unbearable weight for the local community. The silence of the fields was no longer peaceful. It was a reminder of a killer who had never been caught and a family whose blood had soaked into the very floorboards of the barn. In an attempt to exorcise the collective trauma, the village decided to demolish the farm. As the heavy wooden beams were pulled down and the stone walls crumbled, the farm gave up one final physical secret. Hidden deep within the attic floorboards, wrapped in grease-stained rags, was the murder weapon, the iron mattock. It was still stained with the hair and dried residue of the Gruber family. The location of the weapon confirmed what many had feared. The killer hadn't just visited the attic. They had considered it a permanent station, stowing their tools of death exactly where they slept. The demolition didn't bring closure, it only deepened the mystery. Without a physical crime scene to study, the case moved into the realm of folklore and academic study. Over the following century, the file was opened and closed dozens of times. In 2007, students at the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy took a final, modern crack at the cold case using 21st-century profiling techniques. They analyzed the logistics of the farm, the psychological profile of the victims, and the behaviors of the primary suspects. While they reached a definitive conclusion and narrowed the identity down to a single prime suspect, they chose to keep the name sealed. Because the suspect had long since passed away and his direct descendants were still alive in the region, the police academy opted for a silent resolution to prevent a new wave of vigilantism or social shaming against an innocent generation. The legacy of Hinterkaifeck lives on because it shatters the fundamental illusion of the safe home. The terror of this case isn't just the act of murder, but the violation of the sanctuary. The detail of the killer feeding the cattle and cooking meals suggests a chilling level of comfort with death. It implies that to the murderer, the Grubers were merely obstacles in the way of a quiet life on the farm. The impact of this case on German culture is immense, serving as the blueprint for the slasher in the house subgenre of horror. It serves as a grim reminder that a locked door only protects you if the threat is outside. If the intruder is already in the attic, the lock on the front door is nothing more than a courtesy to the person who is about to kill you. Today, nothing remains of the original structures. If you drive to the site between the towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, you will find only a flat, unassuming field and a small stone memorial. The shrine is modest, featuring the names of the victims and a plea for their souls to rest in peace. But the ground itself feels heavy. For decades, locals avoided the area after dark, claiming that the sound of a phantom mattock hitting wood can still be heard when the wind catches the trees. Whether or not the land is haunted is a matter of belief, but the historical fact is undeniable. A man lived with his victims for nearly a week, walked where they walked, and breathed the air they breathed before simply evaporating into the Bavarian mist. The Hinterkaifeck massacre remains the ultimate open loop in true crime. It is a story with no hero, no trial, and no satisfaction. It is a clinical study in how a single human being can infiltrate a family's life so completely that he becomes part of the architecture before destroying it. The mystery persists because it asks a question we are all afraid to answer. How well do we really know the shadows in our own homes? The next time you hear a settling floorboard or a faint scrape from the crawlspace above your head, your mind will inevitably drift back to the Grubers. They thought they were hearing ghosts. They were wrong. They were hearing a guest who had no intention of leaving until the house was his alone.